Now that we've explored the scrapped content of Sun and Moon, X and Y, Black and White, and Diamond and Pearl, today we're taking the next step and covering Generation 3. As always, the goal of these deep dives isn't to rehash well-known topics. Instead, we're focusing on the lesser-known details that add so much depth to Ruby and Sapphire's development. Let's kick things off with one of the most intriguing scrap designs, a mystery gift turtle. Now, it's unclear whether this was an actual Pokemon planned for the game or just a mascot for the mystery gift feature, but regardless of its purpose, we certainly got robbed of this friend-shaped design, and it seems like the kind of Pokemon that would have been perfect for plush merchandise. We'll dive into more scrapped Pokemon later in the video, but for now let's shift gears and look at the origins of Generation 3 itself, specifically looking at the pitch document written on December 22nd, 2000. To provide some context, this document was written roughly a week after Pokemon Crystal had released in Japan, and about a year after Gold and Silver had launched, so it's still unclear whether development on Generation 3 had already begun prior to this date, or if Game Freak was entirely focused on Pokemon Crystal until late 2000. I'm sure you've heard the story that Gold and Silver were originally intended to be the final Pokemon games, and if that's true, then maybe Game Freak truly had no plans to continue the series. But at some point in late 2000, something changed. Given that Ruby and Sapphire launched in 2002, a 2-year development cycle sounds about right for a Game Boy Advance title. But if work didn't begin until after Pokemon Crystal's release, it suggests that the decision to continue Pokemon was made surprisingly late. Before Ruby and Sapphire became the names we know today, the games were internally referred to as Pokemon AGB, short for Advanced Game Boy. Keep in mind the Game Boy Advance had been announced for September 2000, just a few months before development on Generation 3 ramped up. What's really interesting is that Game Freak considered this Pokemon 3, continuing the trend from Gold and Silver, which was originally called Pokemon 2. This suggests that internally, Game Freak used to may not think in terms of generations like fans do, but rather as direct numbered sequels. A nice little insight into how they would approach development. So Ruby and Sapphire's central theme was originally built around the coexistence of people and Pokemon. The world was meant to showcase Pokemon thriving in beautiful locations, while the conflict came from the people raising them, rather than the Pokemon being inherently good or bad. Interestingly, environmental issues were explicitly not meant to be a theme, a detail that contradicts the final game's story, where Team Magma and Team Aqua fight over land and sea expansion. This could suggest that early drafts of the story focused more on human relationships with Pokemon rather than large-scale regional takeover. A very fascinating early idea suggests that the games were originally set 7 years before Red and Green. It would mean the Hoenn games took place 10 years before Gold and Silver, creating a clear chronological order for the first 3 Pokemon eras. However, in the final games, Ruby and Sapphire instead occur at the same time as Red and Green. But here's the big question. Why was Generation 3 originally meant to be a prequel? Gold and Silver embraced its place as a sequel, referencing Kanto's past, using a time capsule mechanic for trading, and even showing how Gym Leaders and Team Rocket changed over time. So if Hoenn had taken place years before Red and Green, what would Game Freak have done to show this time difference? Would we have seen an early version of Team Rocket forming in Hoenn? Could there have been characters from Kanto and Johto in their younger years? Whenever the case, Game Freak ultimately abandoned the prequel idea, placing Hoenn in the present day instead. But it's fascinating to think about what the story might have been like if they had stuck with this timeline. One of Game Freak's major goals with Ruby and Sapphire was to create a region filled with nature. Oceans, mountains, forests, and woods, which they absolutely achieved. Game Freak also wanted to showcase different weather patterns in Ruby and Sapphire, including rain, snow, and other environmental effects. Weather mechanics did make it into the final game, however snow was completely absent, likely because they couldn't find a fitting location in Hoenn. Another scrapped concept was the inclusion of buses and other vehicles throughout the region. While Pokemon has always had references to transportation, actual road vehicles weren't featured throughout the region until Sun and Moon. Even then, probably not to the full extent Game Freak wanted, having traffic flow on the roads. Perhaps they wanted a more lively atmosphere with moving vehicles. Points to Yokai Watch for beating Game Freak to the punch, but it's still interesting that Game Freak wanted to implement ideas like these almost 15 years earlier. Today's video is sponsored by Manta Sleep. They make the best sleep mask and functional sleep accessories, but there's more to Manta than that. Everything they do is driven by their pro-nap movement and enable better lives through better sleep. Manta sleep masks are fully adjustable to fit anyone. They provide 100% blackout and are made with incredibly soft and breathable materials. Plus, with their eye cups, There's absolutely no pressure on your eyes or eyelids for maximum comfort. They offer a range of masks to suit different needs, including the Cool Mask, Steam Mask, Pro Mask, Weighted Mask, and the Sound Mask, which comes with built-in Bluetooth speakers, perfect for listening to audiobooks, music, or your favorite podcast while you relax. A huge thank you to Manta Sleep for sponsoring this video. I love their products, so check them out using the link in the description. And don't forget to use code TURTLE for 10% off your order. Now let's get back to the video. A mechanic for increasing individuality to Pokemon was also considered. This would introduce features or mechanics that would encourage catching multiple of the same species, or replacing a Pokemon in your party with another of the same species. This would also impact the battle mechanics, growth, and moves. Pokemon would even have multiple cries and or unique animations. While this idea wasn't fully realized, it did evolve into the nature system, which was introduced in Ruby and Sapphire and remains a core mechanic today. Game Freak also set a goal to introduce a Pokemon with different spot patterns, and they successfully achieved this with Spinda, whose markings are randomly generated on every individual Pokemon. There was also a plan to update the Pokedex. One major change was that the Pokedex would already be full of species information, unlike previous games where you had to unlock the information. They also wanted to shift the focus away from completing the national dex, since trading with Generation 1 and 2 wasn't possible. This decision likely influenced the creation of Fire Red and Leaf Green, as those remakes allowed players to complete the national dex in Generation 3. Instead, the focus would be to complete the Hoenn dex, which was originally meant to have only 150 Pokemon, but was later expanded to 202 in the final release. Game Freak also considered allowing players to trade non-Pokemon items directly, a feature that still doesn't exist in mainline Pokemon games. In the final games, the only way to trade items is by giving them to a Pokemon, then trading that Pokemon. The underwater diving mechanic did make it into Ruby and Sapphire, but an interesting detail from the early development notes states that certain Pokemon would enable humans to dive. This does sound similar to the Pokemon Ride system introduced in Sun and Moon, where specific Pokemon replaced HMs and helped with overworld travel. Perhaps this means that Game Freak designed a lot of Hoenn's water Pokemon with the idea that they would mechanically allow you to dive underwater. Another interesting concept from the development notes is the mention of in-battle Pokemon fusions, which might be a translation error where it's referencing evolutions instead. However, even if it refers to evolution, this tells us that Game Freak was experimenting with the idea of Pokemon evolving during battle. This has been a core mechanic in the Pokemon anime since Season 1. They also wanted to take Pokemon Cries in the same direction that Pokemon Stadium did. For those of you that don't know, the Pokemon Stadium games introduced their own set of cries for every single Pokemon and made them sound more animal-like. I actually love this idea, and it's surprising that a lot of the Generation 1 and 2 Pokemon still use their original Game Boy cries in modern Pokemon games. Following the original pitch for Ruby and Sapphire, I want to dive into some early character design documents that reflect how the story was shaping up just a year before the game's release. These documents reveal major differences in the original storyline, particularly in the villain teams, their leaders, and even Hoenn's gym leaders. First, let's highlight the Tunnel Gang, which eventually evolved into Team Magma. Originally, the leader of Tunnel Gang was supposed to be one of the directors of Devon Corp, the same corporation that still exists in the final game, but plays a much smaller role. This Devon director would have had a positive public persona, acting as the face of the company, but secretly he was manipulating the Devon Corp president to fund the underground organization known as Tunnel Gang. Tunnel Gang members would have infiltrated Devon Corp as assistants as a result of this. In the final version of Ruby and Sapphire, Devon Corp remains a friendly organization, mainly serving as a way to introduce Steven Stone into the story, since he is the president's son. However, if this original concept had been kept, Devon Corp being the secret mastermind behind one of the villain teams would have been a huge plot twist. Considering Tunnel Gang's tunnel theme, it's likely their goal was a bit different from Team Magma, perhaps expanding the land for Groudon or building an underground network. On the other side of the conflict, there was Marine Gang, which would later become Team Aqua. The leader of Marine Gang was supposed to be a feared pirate captain who controlled the Western Seas. However, unlike his villainous public reputation, he was actually a protector of Pokemon, his actions misunderstood by the world. He was falsely seen as a kidnapper because he would rescue endangered Pokemon from Tunnel Gang and other groups. His ultimate plan was to release all of the Pokemon he had gathered, using a rocket. Yes, I'm serious. This could obviously be linked to Mossdeep City Space Center, but how exactly launching Pokemon into space was supposed to help them is a mystery. Regardless, his noble intentions make him far more of an anti-hero than a true villain, which is a nice contrast to Tunnel Gang. Another huge difference was that the Marine Gang captain was also the gym leader of Suitopolis City. This actually makes a lot of sense, given that Suitopolis is an isolated waterlogged city, which would have fit perfectly with Marine Gang ruling over it. There was also a short description of a group of characters called the 12 Generals. These were 12 trainers who supported Marine Gang's cause and would act alongside the captain. The final game completely removes this concept, and we have no direct equivalent. By the wording, it seems that rather than being 12 high-ranking grunts, they were likely 12 independent trainers that the player would meet throughout the journey. So who would have been the 12 generals? Let me know your theories in the comments. Wallace was still present in this early concept, but his role was quite different. Instead of being the Suitopolis gym leader, he was simply called the Prince of Water. Suitopolis itself was considered the water capital, which further supports the idea that Marine Gang controlled the city. But a huge surprise reveals that Wally was supposed to become the Mossdeep City Gym Leader later in the game. A later gym document from April 2002 even reveals that Wally was still the Mossdeep City Gym Leader at this point in development. This means that at some point late into development, the Wally idea was scrapped and the inclusion of Tate and Lisa was likely a last-minute decision, possibly to showcase double battles, which were a major new feature in Ruby and Sapphire. Now let's take a look at some early visuals for the games, like this Pokedex concept art that kinda looks like an Osmo Pocket, or some of the concept images for the graphics. Most of the early concept images for Ruby and Sapphire's graphics stayed relatively close to the final product, but this concept image in particular is the exception. I don't exactly know what it is, but something about it feels like Johto. Maybe because of a lack of colors, or the darker, more muted tones. There's also this concept piece of Entei and Pichu battling in what seems to be a real-world setting. Perhaps this implies that Game Freak wanted to create unique backgrounds in battle depending on where we were. The final game does have some simple battle background variations, but nothing nearly as detailed as what we got in later generations. In fact, early UI mockups show this realistic battle setting more clearly, making it evident that Game Freak initially wanted a more detailed battle environment, before simplifying it in the final version. Here's actually a better look at the background. I wonder what the design philosophy was that made Game Freak cut this idea altogether. On the topic of the UI, I want to highlight how different the beta UI is compared to the final version. It's just a lot more colorful, and while I love the design, at the same time, if we're breaking down the design philosophy in the final version, maybe Game Freak wanted the focus to be more on the Pokemon instead, and perhaps the colorful UI would have taken away from the main focus. The UI does look nice in the mockup though, and it kind of reminds me of the gold and silver graphics. I also want to show this early concept art of the Hoenn region, which is almost identical to the final version, except for one key difference. In the early map, there's a large landmass to the west that is completely absent in the final game. This suggests that Hoenn was originally meant to connect to a larger mainland, rather than being a completely isolated island. Keep in mind the Hoenn region is based off a Kyushu island in Japan, and geographically there's this piece of mainland Japan that almost connects to Kyushu, yet it's never represented in the Hoenn region map. It's an interesting detail, especially when considering how other Pokemon regions were portrayed. Kanto and Johto seem to be connected to a larger landmass, and Sinnoh, being based on Hokkaido, is never presented as a sole island. In fact, the Legends Arceus map lets us see a tiny bit more of a surrounding area, and it still perfectly aligns with Hokkaido's structure, while not revealing too much. Unlike these regions, Hoenn in the final game is a completely standalone island, so I think it's a nice detail that originally Hoenn seemed to be connected to a larger landmass. Out of all the deep dives we've done, Ruby and Sapphire easily had the most scrapped Pokemon designs, but it goes even beyond that. And it seems Game Freak originally considered a completely different art direction for the sprites. Of course, Pokemon Crystal had some of the most stunning sprite work on the Game Boy Color, with clear visuals and shading that reflected Ken Sugimori's watercolor style. However, Ruby and Sapphire moved away from this, opting for a more direct anime-inspired approach. The final Hoenn sprites look almost identical to how Pokemon appear in the anime. However, this wasn't originally the plan, as the beta sprites had a less anime-like appearance, artistically leaning more towards the classic JRPG monster designs from the 90s. One major difference is the absence of black outlines, a common trait in Pokemon sprites until Generation 8. Without the bold outlines, the Pokemon blend more naturally into the backgrounds, giving them a more organic feel. To me, it implies that there was originally a unique visual style for Hoenn, but ultimately Game Freak went with a more recognizable anime look. An archive of scary Pokemon concept art designs were found too, many of these designs being early versions of Pokemon that appeared in the final game. However, these designs were much more intimidating and detailed. straying far from a traditional Pokemon art style. And it further implies that Game Freak were experimenting with a new art direction, potentially considering a darker, more monster-like approach. If we take a look at the scrapped Pokemon sprites themselves, you'll find numerous unused designs. My favourite has to be this Pokemon called Penpin, a creature that resembles a mix between a chicken and a bowling pin. The infamous beta blaziken design is also present among these beta sprites, especially known for its very similar design to Latias. I also want to highlight this Pokemon, which is called Evoluto, a Pokemon that supposedly had the ability to evolve into any Pokemon. It does sound incredibly complex, especially given how many Pokemon existed by Generation 3, and it's unclear how Game Freak intended for this mechanic to work. Maybe some sort of lottery system once it hits a certain level? And here's a list of Hoenn Pokemon names and their silly early localization names. A few of these beta names actually made it into the final game, while others were completely changed. To wrap things up, here's a look at various never before seen high quality concept art for various Hoenn Pokemon created midway through development. I also want to take this moment to thank you guys for watching this video. Pokemon Emerald was the first Pokemon game I ever completed, so I have a strong connection to Hoenn, and diving into the scrapped content of Ruby and Sapphire has been a blast, so I hope you enjoyed this deep dive as much as I did. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next one.